I'm Lisa Stone. Thank you for joining us for this edition of Parenting Aces.
Thanks for joining us for this week's episode of the Parenting Aces podcast. I'm your host, Lisa Stone, and we are joined by Adam Van Zee, who is a former coach at Earlham College in Indiana. Earlham is a small D3 school, and Adam is going to be talking with us this week about the benefits of playing at a Division III school, what it can offer to prospective student athletes, and how the recruiting process looks when you are pursuing a spot at a Division III university. It's really interesting to hear him talk about his experiences both as a player at the D3 level and as a coach, and now writing and really developing his expertise around Division III tennis. And I hope that all of you will really pay attention to what he has to say and seriously consider looking at some of these Division III schools. These programs not only have great tennis, but also are so strong academically, and Adam is going to dispel some of the myths around playing at the Division III level. For a closer look at Division III tennis, I urge you to visit Adam's website, and that is division3tennis.com. It's division3tennis.com. And all of the links and contact information for Adam Van Zee and the Division III tennis website will be included in the show notes, so be sure and check that out. Enjoy this week's episode. I'll be quiet now, and here is Adam Van Zee when we return.
Tennisballs.com is your one-stop shop for all the latest tennis news, stories, and photos from around the world. Their talented writers share insights from the Pro Tour, the latest tennis technology, and behind-the-scenes looks at your favorite tennis tournaments and events. Check out tennisballs.com. That's 10sballs.com.
I'm so glad you decided to tune back into the Parenting Aces podcast this week. We have Adam Van Zee with us, and Adam works with the D3 recruiting group. They have a website. They have a recruiting hub now, and Adam comes from the Division III coaching world in Indiana at Earlham College, but he is now blogging and podcasting and doing all sorts of stuff around Division III tennis. So, Adam, thank you so much for joining us. I'm really excited to jump into a conversation about Division III tennis with you today.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me. And so my experience at D3 has been nothing but positive, and you know, I enjoy the opportunity to share that knowledge.
Absolutely. So let's start by having you tell our listeners a little bit about your coaching experience at the D3 level.
Yeah, I mean, so not only was I a coach, I also played at Division III level. So I was a graduate to Wabash College, which is also in Indiana. So that experience sort of guided me into coaching. Between the years between my playing days and my coaching days, I went and got a master's in sports psychology. So I was doing that, and then I was fortunate enough to get a Division III head coaching job at age 24, which is, you know, pretty young. So I don't think I quite knew what I was getting into, but it was a process of learning and whatnot. And, you know, Earlham at the time was not a very strong tennis program, so I kind of had a blank slate to start from. But using my Division III background and playing and, you know, my love for what Division III represents, I was able to pretty quickly, you know, form a very successful men's program. And, you know, it's strictly behind the thought of recruiting the right student athletes and, you know, figuring out what the right student athlete for that particular school is what's most important. You know, obviously you're going to always try to get the most talented ones, but at the same time, just because they're the most talented doesn't mean they're going to fit at the school. So, you know, Division III offers a lot of different opportunities, you know, across the schools, depending on what the particular student athlete is interested in after college. So I really enjoyed being a part of the process with, you know, student athletes when I had them, and then obviously recruiting, and after they were to leave. So, you know, I really enjoyed it. You know, I miss it at times. And I'm no longer in the coaching world, but I'm fortunate enough to have my hand in Division III a little bit with the blog that we run.
Absolutely. So there are tons of misconceptions about Division III, and I really would love to take this next hour or so for you to address some of those misconceptions and explain to the Parenting Aces audience, which is mostly made up of tennis parents, of junior players. Explain to us why we need to be looking more closely at Division III for our kids as they're approaching their college recruiting years.
Yeah, I mean, I think the two biggest misconceptions, one by parents and one by the student athletes, are the one by parents is money. A lot of times they see these private, liberal arts or research universities have price tags in excess of $50,000. And, from the initial view, that seems like, oh my gosh, that is a lot of money. And it is. But, one of the biggest misconceptions is that there is no financial aid available. And that's completely wrong. Most of these schools have competitively packaged with academic scholarships, with grants, and obviously there's some government aid as well. So I think that's on the parent side of things that, if you see this price tag that's, seems outrageous, and a lot of times it is, where I was at Earlham, I think 94% of students received financial aid. And at the time when I was there, I think the sticker price was around $49,000, but the average student was paying, I think, $21,000, $22,000. In the state of Indiana, a normal tuition for a state school, I think, was $19,000. So you're only paying a little bit more and likely getting into a better school with some better options. The misconception on the student-athlete side, particularly, and this isn't necessarily true across all sports, but in tennis, is the level of play isn't that far off of Division I. And, that seems crazy to think about, but because tennis is such a academically focused prospect, the level of players that are tracked to Division III are pretty darn good. The best way to give an example of this is, we've got programs with multiple five-star athletes based off tennisrecruiting.net's ranking system that aren't even in the starting lineup at some schools. And, we've got Division III teams that are not only challenging but beating top 75 Division I programs, on a yearly basis. So I think that misconception that, if I go to Division III, I'm not going to be playing the same level of competition that I would at other, at Division I institutions is completely wrong. And again, I think it's just part of what tennis breeds in terms of the type of player that is interested in playing, that it happens. Like, very rarely are you going to see, let's just say if there's a five-star basketball player, basketball player is not going to go to a Division III school. It just doesn't happen. But in tennis, because of the academic reputation that these schools have and the interest of that by the student athletes and their families, the level of tennis is extremely high and is continually to get higher as the years go on. I think the boom has probably happened in the last 10 to 15 years where five-star athletes, we used to get one or two a year that attract Division III, but now I think right now there's 8 or 9, maybe even 10 that are committed to a program this year. So that's the biggest misconception on the student athlete side is I've got to go D1 because I want to play the top competition day in and day out.
Interesting. Well, I mean, I was doing a little research on the NCAA website and found out that Division III is actually the largest of the NCAA divisions. There are 450 member schools, and I had no idea it was that big. And the other thing that I thought was so interesting is that out of the student athletes at Division III schools, 82% of them have some sort of financial aid, whether it's a grant or scholarship. And just as a basis of comparison, 56% of Division I students have some sort of financial aid. So it's 82% at Division III 61% at Division II, and 56% at Division I. So it truly is a misconception on the part of us parents that there's not money available. And also, just to clarify, the NCAA states that Division III cannot offer athletic scholarships. And so I think we hear that and think that means there's no money available to our kids.
You're absolutely right. And like I said, I think that the biggest thing is because these are top schools, tennis typically breeds some top students. They're going to competitively try to attract those top students to their top schools. So, you've got a $20,000 academic scholarship because that school wants that person because their academic resume is that impressive. So it's just a little bit different of a competition in terms of trying to attract a student, whereas Division I is trying to attract a student because of their tennis abilities. Division III is trying to attract a student because of their academic abilities.
Yeah, and that's a big distinction. And I wonder, one of the debates that happens quite often on, especially my Facebook page, the Parenting Aces Facebook page, is this whole notion of keeping your child in traditional school versus doing virtual school or homeschool. And, there are people that come down hard on both sides of the argument. As a coach or former coach, what is your thought on that, and how does it impact recruiting for Division III?
Yeah, I think because tennis is a little bit different, it's a little bit easier to, while it's a team sport in college, it's still very individual. So I think on the tennis side of things, it's the homeschooled or the virtual school student is still going to be playing in tournaments where I can actively see results. In terms of where they may thrive as a student after their high school education, I think homeschool students or virtual students would have a lot of success at a smaller school. Whereas if you send that student to a big Division I university, they all of a sudden become a very, very small fish in a very, very large pond. So I think tennis it's unique in a lot of ways. But I think Division III, particularly for homeschooled students, is a very good option because it wouldn't be quite the overwhelming, I'm going to go from being the only student to such a large pool of students.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that makes sense. And in terms of academics, are you hearing that these students are performing well academically?
I think it's very similar in terms of, if you have a student that's homeschooled, and then they go to let's just say a big university, their first year of classes, they're probably going to be sitting in a lot of, freshman classes with hundreds of students sitting in the same class. Whereas they go to Division III school or a small liberal arts or even research university, they're going to sit, their biggest class is probably going to be, 40 students, and that's on the high end. So they're going to be able to be engaged a lot more with their classmates. They're forced into participating, and in terms of development of the student and development of, who they are as a person, that can go a long way. I'll use myself as an example. I went to a small liberal arts school, and, even after my first semester, I remember talking to a close family friend, and they looked at me and they said, you're different. I said, what do you mean I'm different? I'm the same person. And I said, you just sound different. You seem more confident. You seem more, engaging in a lot of ways. I said, I haven't really done anything different. But so even one semester in that environment, I really started to thrive as a person.
Interesting. One of the I guess, and I'm using air quotes, and my listeners know I talk with my hands a lot, which is not good for podcasting, but oh well. So another one of the issues is if you want to have any chance of turning pro as a tennis player, that you have to go to Division I. You have to go to one of the Power 5 conference schools. And I've had Eric Buderak on my podcast, and one of the things
use my best example.
Well, he is, and I wanted to get your perspective on that because one of the things that's so unique about Eric is he did go to a Division III school, and he wound up having a phenomenal career as a professional tennis player, mainly in doubles, but, and he's still just intimately involved in the sport at the highest levels. And I'd love to hear your take on Eric's experience and then any other student athletes that you may have come across who maybe started in Division I and wound up transferring to a Division III school and had similar successes.
Yeah, I mean, obviously Eric is the prime example. I mean, he started Division I. He played at a MAC school, Ball State, for a year, and then transferred to a Division III school. And I don't remember when he published an article. It was basically, it was sort of a right coach, right program, just wrong school type article. And, he didn't have necessarily a bad experience there. He just wasn't the right fit for him. So, moving into Division III, and even when he moved to Division, he didn't necessarily dominate right away. He took some time to sort of get his feet on the ground and have the opportunity. So, he's the poster child for it doesn't necessarily mean you can't go pro. And I think as Division III, since he was a player to now, the level has just exploded. And again, that you've got these 5-star athletes that aren't even playing on their team because it's just they're so loaded. So, the growth continues to happen. And, you look at some of these top schools in the country or even in the world, you got Chicago's, the Amherst, they're attracting the better students and the better tennis players. They have the ability to, go on and do other things. An example that's happening sort of right now is there's a female student athlete at Wesleyan, Eunice Chong, who is currently, she's a junior this year. She's a 2-time defending national champion, has some Division III losses, but also is currently ranked in the ITF and WTA because she's from Hong Kong. She goes back for breaks, and she plays in professional tournaments, and she's getting wins. So it's showing that, you would think a person at that level would just be dominating Division III, and while she's got 2 national championships, she's also never gone undefeated throughout the years. So she's taking some losses. So she's getting not only is she getting the education she wants, the experience that she wants as a college student athlete, but she's also training just as much to be successful at the pro level.
Well, that's a great segue into my next question, which is, another hot topic has been the proliferation of international players, especially on the men's side, and how, at Division I, there are only 4.5 scholarships, and how a lot of schools, are giving the majority of that scholarship money to international players. What's happening in Division III in terms of domestic versus international players on the rosters and in terms of scholarship and grant money?
Yeah, I mean, it's still very, very heavily domestic. There are some schools that are more, I guess worldly is not the right word, but have more of a pull for international students, but it's still very, very heavy. There's specific schools that are very heavy in international, but I would say that's in, the less than 5% schools that have that. I had both when I was a coach. Earlham, the place that I was at as a coach, was very international focused. They were very diversity focused, so they had a very competitive scholarship package for international students, but that was a student-wide initiative. So when I learned that, my team was basically half and half. I had half internationals and half domestic, but overall Division III is extremely domestic with, a few very, programs that are very strong in international recruiting. But for the most part, domestic it's hard to sell somebody, a small liberal arts school in the middle of Indiana compared to, a big university that they can see on TV, because most of these students internationally just want to come and play. They don't necessarily know what they're getting into school-wise. So if you've got a school in, say, Chicago or LA, that's a pull because they know what that is. Whereas if I start to talk about, Earlham, which is in Richmond, Indiana, they have no clue. So I think that international is one way to go, but it's a tough road to go down because, the academic standards are pretty high at a lot of these schools, and if English is their second language, they've got more tests to pass and all that kind of stuff.
Right. It's interesting. I was actually talking to an international player this past week, and he was telling me that he had no idea where he was coming or any idea about the school he was coming to. I mean, he knew nothing. He knew nothing about the weather. He knew nothing about the academic reputation, the tennis reputation. He just knew he wanted to come to the States and play tennis and go to college. And so that fits right in with what you're saying. And so I always wonder, is that an advantage for maybe the smaller D3 programs? Because these kids, the international kids, aren't really doing a ton of research. I think for a lot of them, they're relying on consultants to guide them properly, and a lot of the times the consultants may not really know much about the school. So is there truth to the notion that the coaches develop pipelines into certain countries or areas of the world where they can recruit, or is that just kind of one of those nasty rumors that keeps circulating among us parents?
I wouldn't say it's a nasty rumor. I mean, like I said, I'll just use myself as an example. I had a pipeline through a recruiting service that had players out of Russia. And similar, I mean, for the most part, you're right in that they didn't necessarily know what they were getting into. I would say the only one thing that a lot of them do pay attention to was academic reputation. They wanted to go to the best school that they could go to. But again, the problem is the academic standards are a little higher. So, I could recruit, let's just say, 10, just to give a round number. 1 or 2 could probably have the academic standards to get in. And then they start to qualify for the academic scholarship that the school had to offer. But, it's good to, when it comes to international recruiting, it's all about who you know, because they're taking a leap of faith on you and your program. And like I said, once I got one, I basically averaged 1 a year after that because they trusted me and they were getting positive feedback from the student athlete that came. So I don't think it's necessarily a false idea that these parents have when it comes to international recruiting. But at the same time, the students want the opportunity to go to a good college and want the opportunity to play at the college level, because internationally there's really not, particularly in Europe and in Asia, there's not a college sports system. You either are set up to train as a junior and go pro, or you train as a junior and you're not good enough yet to go pro. So they don't have any options to continue to play, the sport that they've played for 10 years once they reach that level. So the pull of just being able to go to college, get a good education, and still play is pretty strong.
Mm-hmm. What was your experience with your international players in terms of them staying in the States after college versus going back to their country of origin? And the reason I'm asking is I keep trying to find some data on alumni giving in tennis, and that data is very hard to come by. But I would think, especially for these smaller schools, the Division III schools, that they are very reliant on their alumni donations. And I think tennis as a whole has a high level of alumni giving, but I've yet to find the data showing giving by country. So I'm just curious what your experience was.
Yeah, I mean, I was fortunate enough. Like I said, I've had numerous student athletes that are international, and I've got, I think, about not quite half, but a third of them are still in the States, and most of them are back in their home country. The problem that they run into, after they graduate, is visas. There's a couple options. They can get sponsored by a company that they work for, which is very expensive and a very tough process to go through for the company. So if they're lucky enough to be granted a visa for that, then they can stay and work for however long the visa lasts. Otherwise, they basically have a year. Once they graduate, they get a year visa to if they want to stay, to find a place to stay and someone to sponsor their visa. The one that I, off the top of my head is for, he's a tennis pro in New York City, and it's because he married a domestic student as well. So he got his green card through marriage. Everybody else has basically gone back because of the visa process, and it's difficult. It's getting more difficult as things occur. In terms of giving, obviously that's the area I'm in now. Culturally, internationally, philanthropy for non-U.S. students is not very good. And that's just, it's a cultural thing. It's not necessarily that they didn't experience, but internationally, a lot of the programs that are run are state funded or country funded. So they aren't they don't have the thought process that, I need to give back for this program to continue to be successful. So it's a tough kind of road to go down internationally when it comes to philanthropy, just because they're not born with that thought that I need to give back. So it's a lot of education, and it's a lot of schools struggle with it because the resources you have to throw at it to get a return are equal to or even more than what you may get back in return. So it's a tough thing in terms of philanthropy.
Yeah, interesting. Well, let's shift gears a little and talk a little bit more from the recruiting side of things. So let's say, I have a sophomore in high school and my child is, planning to play college tennis. And, of course, all he knows about are the big schools that are always on TV and in the news. Well, always on TV. That's kind of a misnomer because tennis isn't on TV that much. But those are the schools that he knows, and that's where he wants to focus his efforts. How do I, as a parent, get him to widen his net? What are some tools that you, as a former coach and as a former player, would suggest to really convince these kids? And let's face it, a lot of it has to do with their junior coaches, too, who are guiding them, right? So maybe you can share some ideas of how we can convince the coaches and the kids to give D3 a shot, and what are some of the questions they need to ask to determine whether they're a better fit at D1, D2, or D3?
Yeah, no, I think the first questions have to come from within. It's a matter of where geography-wise do they want to be, if that's a limiting factor, because that narrows the search down pretty significantly. And then what do they want? Do they want, a highly competitive tennis program? Do they want a small liberal arts school? Do they want a research university? So that's a little bit tougher to talk about because they're only sophomores in high schools and they probably don't know what they want yet.
Right. That's what I was just getting ready to say. I mean, we're talking about 15, 16-year-old kids who, to them, college tennis is this panacea, this Xanadu of beautiful, awesome, you walk around campus and everybody knows who you are and treats you like a god. And the reality is, I don't care what division you go to, that is not the case.
Well, unfortunately, that's the wrong sport.
Yeah, exactly.
It's like I said, I mean, it's a matter of, I think geography is the first key. But if you don't have any narrowing down in terms of that, there's quite a few options across all levels wherever you're at. If you're on the West Coast, there's great Division I programs. Obviously, there's also great Division III programs. Same thing on the East Coast, same thing in the Midwest and South. Depending on where they're at, there's a little bit less choices in some regards, but I think research. I mean, the biggest thing is just to start your research now. If you want the best of the best in terms of tennis, you've got to figure out, one, am I at the level or will I be at the level to be able to play for these? So that's another big question is where, do you want to be the stud at the school that you're going to go to, or do you want to work your way into the lineup? Mm-hmm. And that's a hard question. A lot of coaches struggle to give the honest answer because they don't want to, dash any dreams, but at the same time, they don't want a kid to choose their school and then go 4 years and, barely crack the lineup. So that's a big part of it is sort of do your research in terms of figure out what level you're at and kind of what you want to get out of a tennis experience. And, you know, one thing that we've started at the blog is a sort of a recruiting hub that it's going to profile all these programs that we cover, and these profiles are going to basically say, this is kind of the power, you know, UTR level, also the tennis recruiting .net level, where, you know, a typical starter is in the lineup. And, you know, the thing that I think a lot of people would be surprised by is if they were to look at these profiles, we've got schools where the typical starter is in the top 100. And, you know, there's only so many of those to go around. So the fact that these kids are choosing these schools is a testament to how strong they are. So I think that's the first step, is sort of being able to evaluate your own level of skill and then also what you want out of a school. If you think, you know, over the next 2 to 4 years you're going to really dedicate yourself to the game and raise your level of play, then maybe some of the, you know, the top schools, top 10, top 20 Division I schools are an option. But if you can say, hey, I'm not quite there and I don't know if I'm going to get there, you can start to eliminate schools that you may not have a chance to play at.
And let me just throw this out there, and this is something that I've said many, many times, and others have said as well. If you're not in the starting lineup your freshman year, the likelihood is that you're not ever going to be in the starting lineup. And people need to understand that. Working your way into the lineup doesn't happen very often, because the coaches are constantly trying to recruit number 1 and number 2 players. They're not
Absolutely
out there looking for the number 5 and 6 player. They're looking for the new number 1 and 2, and that means everybody gets pushed down, which means that if you're number 7, 8, or 9, you know, the likelihood that you're going to crack the top 6 is very, very low. So I think it's important that people have a realistic understanding of how that works.
And that, like I said, that's a difficult thing to get across. I mean, one of the most common questions I would have, you know, if I had a recruit on campus with his or her parents, and they sit down, the question that always seemed to be asked is, how many players are you trying to bring in? And you know, I think a lot of them were shocked when my answer every single time was, well, if I can bring in 6 players better than the 6 I have now, I'm going to do it. And that sort of takes them aback. Like, what do you guys? You know, my job is to out-recruit the talent I currently have. And you know, not all coaches, I think, are willing to say that. But again, you know, same thing. I don't want a player to come play 5 or 6 as a freshman, and then as we got better, it's just not going to be able to play, and their tennis experience starts to dwindle. You know, it's hard. You know, being an individual, and tennis is a very ego-driven sport. That's hard on an ego to be able to handle it. Hey, I'm just not good enough anymore.
Mm-hmm. It is hard. It's very hard. And, you know, the reality is, too, that for the majority of these kids, college tennis is the end of the line for them. And I say this over and over and over again, I feel like. But I think it's an important point to understand for parents and for players that it's okay if you don't get significantly better in college. If you're planning to be a doctor or an engineer or a taxi driver, like, you know, it doesn't, I mean, you're in college as an athlete to be a student first and an athlete second. And Division III, I think, does a way better job of providing that type of balance than a Division I program, especially a top-level Division I program.
Absolutely. I think that's probably the biggest pull of Division III is you know, the percentage of people that go pro after college tennis is very low. You know, there's no way around that. Even to make any money, you've got to be a top 100 player in the world to be a professional and be successful. And even that is probably being generous. It's even higher than that, just with the travel expenses and all the other different costs. So, you know, you've got to start to think, what's life after tennis going to be like? And if you can accept that, you know, I'm going to have a great college career, but it's probably not going to be the way that I make a living once I'm out of here, Division III provides a ton of options. And, you know, the success rate of graduates of Division III liberal arts and research universities, you know, that's one thing that we've highlighted in our profiles is we give some examples of student athletes that were successful at Division III, but now are, going on and being doctors and lawyers and, hedge fund managers and all sorts of things that are doing these great things, and even nonprofits, starting their own nonprofits. They're doing these great things and sort of, I don't want to sound cliche, but changing the world in a different way. And that's sort of, those success stories are the case of why Division III can be such a great option for, top tennis players to not only thrive as athletes, but thrive as people and thrive as, career-driven individuals after their career's over.
Let's talk a little bit about the number of college tennis programs that disappear. And that mostly seems to be happening at the Division I level. And why do you think the Division III schools seem to be immune to these kinds of cuts? What is it that protects them?
It's a good question. I think that the cost to run a Division I program is significantly higher. Division III continues to go closer to the Division I model in terms of travel and all that kind of stuff, but I think the cost to run a program is quite immense. At Division III, though, the model of a Division III athletics is participation, and so that is ingrained in the colleges, as they know that athletics as a whole is going to, better the person, better the school overall. And I think Division I, it's more of a, we want to be the best athletes as we possibly can. They're going to try to hammer home the student athlete as much as they can. But, I think that Division III is a little bit more immune because a lot of them most schools aren't tuition driven. So they've got, endowments that run the school. So financially, a lot are in better shape. And they're not so focused on just getting the best athletes. They're focused on getting the best students that can enhance their athletic program versus vice versa.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. Every time I hear about a program getting cut, my heart just breaks for the kids because, what do they do at that? Especially the ones that are going into their final year. And I think that's another. Right. And I think that's another factor for families to consider when choosing the college/college tennis program for their child is, what's the viability of the program? And, we look at coaches and we look at records and, we look at travel schedule and all of those things. But I think, you got to look at, is this program going to be around all 4 years that my kid is eligible to play? And it just seems to me, and I have no stats to back this up, but it seems to me that the D3 programs are much more stable.
Well, and I think another way to compare is you look how long the coach has been there. And a Division I, it seems, very rarely are you going to find an average Division I coach that's starting to go up the ranks in terms of just their resume stick around. So it's hard to, you put all your hopes and dreams into this one coach and that coach leaves, then you've got to impress another one and it starts to get a little bit more difficult. Whereas Division III, the top coaches, have been there 20, 30, even 40 years. Because one, they believe in the school, they've made a life there, and they're hopeful to continue to impact students. They're not just looking to move on. Very rarely do you see big time jumps from program to program because when I was still in coaching and maybe looking at different jobs, they just don't open up because those are destination places. It's I want to be here. I want to continue to have an impact. So very similar in terms of. You see programs that are getting dropped, but, in Division III, you rarely see one drop programs and much movement in the coaching ranks.
That's it. Yeah, that's an interesting point. It's something I hadn't thought about in terms of the. Sorry, my dog is finding a playmate outside to talk to. So let's jump back to your recruiting hub on the blog, because that's a new aspect of your website, and it's something that intrigues me, how these PSAs, prospective student athletes, can use that recruiting hub to enhance their recruiting process. So let's dig a little deeper into that. You mentioned it a few minutes ago, but I really want to kind of delve in, and maybe you can kind of create a case study of, let's say, a high school sophomore or junior who is starting their recruiting process. How would they step-by-step utilize that tool to go through the process, reach out to coaches, schedule visits, et cetera, et cetera?
Yeah, I think that the biggest thing that we're doing is as we continue to grow, we're working with coaches to make these profiles. But the kind of the generic statement that I've been telling people is this recruiting hub is basically the Princeton Review with tennis in mind. So these profiles not only give you some stats in terms of what type of player or what level of player typically goes to the school, how long the coach has been there, where it's at, that kind of stuff. But we provide a pretty lengthy explanation of this is what the school represents, this is kind of where it's located, what they offer, what kind of facilities they have, and then we talk about the tennis. Traditionally this is a strong program, this is a program on the up and up, different things like that. So, all they have to do is go to our webpage, which is division3tennis.com, and there's a little tab that says Recruiting Hub, and once they get to that point, they click on basically any school. Right now, we're slowly releasing profiles. I think we've only got 8 out right now, but over the next couple of weeks, each region and they're divided up by regions. Each region is going to have 15 to 20 schools that they can look at. And like I said, these are pretty objective views, but at the same time, we do offer our own opinion, and we've got a lot of experience with a lot of these schools and kind of just traditionally what to expect from these schools. So, if you were to click on, I've got it up here in front of me. So the first school that I can look at is Emory. Emory is a very well-known nationally school, and some of these profiles, they talk about how big the school is, where they're ranked in the U.S. News and World Report, their 3-year average ranking, their Power 6 for UTR, and then we give some ratings of ourselves. So the bloggers, there's 9 of us, rank these schools based off our knowledge of the school, based off academic reputation, the tennis program and tradition, how good they are developing players, facilities, and then we give some examples of the recruiting. So, for example, I'll just use Emory that I have in front of me. We've got Jonathan Jennison was a 4-star, was ranked number 80th in his class 2015. He plays number 2 for them. So it gives you an idea of what kind of player currently is on their roster, and then we give some alums that are doing some pretty awesome things. So through those stats, you can get a better idea, but once you start reading the profile, it gives you even a more in-depth look at what these teams and what these schools have to offer. And it really is sort of it's not a quick synopsis, but it gives you an idea of this is what I'm getting into if I were to look at this school. And I think that it's more than just, hey, they're a good tennis team and it's a good school. It's what you could expect if you're an athlete at this school.
Right. And I think it's really cool because there's really nowhere to get that same in-depth information at the D1 level other than talking to people. And, I think this is a great jumping off point. Okay, so my high school sophomore or junior is on your D3 recruiting hub. They've looked through some of these profiles. They've narrowed down their list to some choices. What's their next step?
Yeah, I think at that point, it's reach out to the coaches and say, particularly if you're not in a geographic area, recruiting for Division III is a little bit tougher in terms of budgets. It's hard for a student that, say, is in the West Coast, if they're looking at an East Coast school, some of the top programs are on the East Coast, for them to get out. So reach out to the coach, say, introduce who you are, kind of give some background to your tennis level, and that starts the relationship. And once the coach is sort of, on the hook, if it's a player that they think is going to be strong for the school and then strong for the tennis program, the process starts from there. I think that The tough part, obviously, is getting able to see them play. But, I was at a very, an above average institution in terms of tennis wise. I drove multiple times, 13 hours to go see my top recruits because I knew that's what it took to get them. So nothing really changes in terms of the recruiting process. And the best, while these profiles are great and they're going to connect you with the people they need to connect you with, you've got to get on campus, and that's where you're going to get the experience of seeing. So the earlier you can do that is either going to, narrow your list down to include that school, or it's going to eliminate schools that, it isn't quite the right fit for me. But I think that the earlier you start that process, the better your offer you're going to be.
And in terms of visiting the school, are the rules the same for Division III as they are for Division I in terms of unofficial and official visits?
Somewhat. I think that because you can go, you don't have to declare it as an official visit, I don't believe, unless that's changed. But, if a junior were to come on campus and want to talk to the tennis coach but is there to see the campus, that's not necessarily, considered an official visit. It's just say you spend an hour to talk with the coach. I think that the more official visits are ones where you were to go and, stay the night, stay with a player, kind of observe practice, that kind of thing. So, there's a lot of similar rules in terms of, you can't participate in practice and that kind of stuff. But for the most part, any visit you go is to see the school and not necessarily to be a part of the tennis program.
Got it. But there are official visits in Division III or no? I mean, can a school pay for a student to come for 48 hours and stay on campus and do all those things?
I know that when I was a coach, we would have, for example, there was a couple Pacific Northwest students that were interested, and the school would pay. It wouldn't come out of the athletic budget, but the school would pay because they were top students. The admissions department would pay for them to fly out and see the school. So yes, there are more official in terms of that, and they're able to do that.
And is there a limit on the number of schools you can do that with? In Division I,
I don't believe
so. 5-school limit.
I'm not positive on that, but I don't believe so.
Okay. I'll look that up and hopefully try to include that in the show notes for those of you listening that might have that same question. Because the rules change so often with the NCAA, and my area where I'm the most well-versed, and I am not by any means well-versed, but the most well-versed is Division I, and just because that's where my kid was looking. And even since he was going through the recruiting process, the rules have changed. And, with social media, things are so complicated now with the contact rules
you're not
and all
kidding.
that.
I'm glad I don't have to deal with that anymore, that's for sure.
Oh, my goodness, seriously. So, okay, so the PSA has read the profiles on your recruiting hub. They have reached out to coaches, and let's say they've got 3 coaches interested. Hopefully, at that point, maybe they're sending some video footage to the coaches, or sending their tournament schedule to the coaches, so the coaches can actually get a feel for what type of player they really are. And then in terms of making that final decision, in Division I, a lot of times the coach makes the offer to the kid accepts the offer and then goes through the academic application process and has to be accepted academically into the school. Mm-hmm. But depending on the situation, the coaches a lot of times have a lot of pull with that and can say to academics, or to admissions, we need to push this kid's application through. Yep. In Division III, how does that work?
Not like that. When a student sends, so let's just say sophomore, junior, sends the tennis resume, they should also send the academic resume, because the coach from day one is going to see that and know, this kid academically is going to be successful and going to get accepted. So, a good coach would be able to know that, a certain SAT score or a certain, academic profile isn't going to be able to get in. And very, very few coaches have any sort of say, in terms of trying to push a kid through. Borderline kids don't get in. It's just the way it is. It's these schools are academically driven, and while athletics play a role in extracurriculars and sort of add to their profile in that sense, if you were to compare a student who is a concert pianist versus a top level tennis player, they're going to get similar point system in the admissions process because they both have successful extracurricular activities. But in terms of any pull that the sport has for the process, the admissions process, it's zero. That's the Division III model is athletics. There is no additional pull. So basically, it comes down to, do they have the right academic profile for the school? And like I said, the earlier you know that, the better off you are. It's a good coach would be dumb to go through the entire process not knowing if this student athlete is going to get accepted.
That's really interesting, and that's a big difference. And
yes.
I hope the parents listening are hearing that. I mean, that's a very big difference, and I think it's really important that if you are deciding to explore Division III schools, that you make sure that your student athlete has the necessary grades and test scores, and do what you can to help them. That's an area that, you can put the work in and make big improvements. And
absolutely.
So, if you know early enough in their high school career that Division III is a viable option for them, then you can really maximize their opportunities there through, additional counseling or tutoring or what have you to boost those scores.
Yeah, absolutely.
So another area that I would like to kind of touch on, and we're coming to the end of our hour, but one other thing that really kind of sets D3 apart is in the case of a student athlete who either gets injured and can't play anymore, or just simply decides they want to not play anymore for whatever reason. They want to pursue their academics or whatever it is. At the Division I level, once you're done with tennis, that scholarship may or may not still be around for you if you're on an athletic scholarship. Depends on the circumstances. If you quit playing, obviously, just by choice, that athletic scholarship definitely is going to go away. At Division III, because you're not on an athletic scholarship, it's a lot of times way more financially viable to stay at a school even without the tennis.
Absolutely. It's a lot of times those scholarships they get, most are academically focused. So as long as they're in academic good standing, so some will have, you've got to maintain a 2.5 or a 3.0 to continue the scholarship. So the motivation is I've got to be a good student, and I've got to earn. So very similar to tennis in terms of, Division I is they've got to earn their keep in terms of I got to continue playing tennis. Well, on the Division III levels, I got to continue being a good student and in good standing to continue to have that. So, the opportunity is definitely the students first, and the scholarships are arranged around that.
Right, and I think this is a really important point for parents to understand, because the reality is that a lot of kids who go into college expecting to play all 4 years don't wind up doing that, whether it's because, again, they get hurt or because they're deciding to pursue an academic endeavor that requires too much time for them to continue their tennis schedule. I mean, there are a lot of reasons that happens, but if you look at the number of tennis players who stay on the team all 4 years, I think, the numbers will support what I'm saying here. And I think that's an important consideration for a family, especially if finances are a big part of the equation.
Absolutely. And I think the one thing, you mentioned it briefly, was, if you go into, if you're a highly competitive Division I tennis player and you're going to, a top 5, top 10 school and you want to be a doctor, your life is going to be determined for the next 4 years. You're going to have specific practice times. You're going to have specific lab times. There is no leeway one way or the other. And a lot of times those things are going to compete against one another, rightfully or wrongfully, however you want to look at it. Whereas, a Division III, if you were to go to a school and decide that, hey, one, you can do both. It's a lot. The time commitment is significantly less. Particularly, there's off seasons. You can't practice under Division I's off seasons. There's still significant practice. Division III, there is not. Whereas you can be able to do both of your goals academically and athletically and be successful in both. It's still going to be difficult in a lot of ways, and you've got to be good. But I think that the two things don't compete against one another in Division III, whereas in Division I they can't, just with travel schedules, practice schedules, match schedules, and different things like that.
For sure. And, I've written about this before, but I mean, I travel to these college tennis matches and the kids are, on their laptops doing work in between their matches. I mean, it is a very tough life. And at the Division I level, your day-to-day life year-round is governed by your tennis coach. And,
yep.
You pick classes based on practice times, and you miss a lot of classes based on the travel schedule. And it's a big challenge, and it takes a certain type of student athlete to be able to manage that. And and I think, one other bit of this that I just want to touch on quickly before we wind up here is that it's not a bad thing to choose Division II or III. It doesn't mean you're less of a player or, that you're compromising because you're not going Division I. And I think a lot of us get caught up in that mindset that, Division I is superior. And after going through it a couple years, in our family, I don't think it's superior. It's just different.
Yeah, I think you touched on it a little bit, I touched on it a little bit with the level of Division III is significantly higher. I mean, yes, that mindset is probably true if you're talking about football, baseball, basketball. That mindset is not true in Division III tennis just because the level is pretty darn good. So you've got to get out of the mindset of, I've got to get a Division I scholarship because I'm going to be, the premier player, whereas because tennis is a little different, Division III tennis, the level is really, really good. I mean, in the last 2 years, we've had 2 or 3 top 50 recruits commit to Division III tennis, and it's because they want a superior education, compete for a national title, both as an individual and as a team, and an overall experience as a student athlete and not just an athlete.
Right. Well, Adam, I want to thank you so much for coming on the show. And to my listeners, please check out Adam's website. It's division3tennis.com, and that website will be in the show notes. So check that out. Check out the Recruiting Hub. And Adam, if my listeners have questions about Division III, whether it's from a recruiting standpoint or just, wanting more details about what it means to play at the D3 level, is it okay if they contact you? And if so, how do they do that?
Yeah, absolutely. I have no problem. Like I said, I'm not tied to any school, so I'll try to be as unbiased as possible. But they can either shoot me an email or, find me on Twitter. My Twitter handle is D3 Central 3 with the number Central Tennis on Twitter, and then you can just email my personal email. I don't mind that. It's and then my last name, VANZEE @gmail. So I'll give you that so you can include in the notes as well. And like I said, I'm a firm believer in Division III, and particularly obviously the tennis experience. But I think that it shapes a lot of people, and they will forever hold that, in their careers, in their lives, and it really, transforms the person that they become.
Fantastic. Well, thank you so much, Adam Van Zee, for joining us this week on the Parenting Aces podcast. And to my listeners, thanks so much for tuning in, and we'll see you next week on Parenting Aces.
Don't miss a thing on Parenting Aces. Be sure to sign up for our free e-newsletter so you're among the first to know when a new article is posted. Simply go to ParentingAces.com and enter your email address, then click subscribe in the Subscribe for Updates box on the right side of the page. I'm Lisa Stone, and you've been listening to the Parenting Aces podcast. For tennis parents, by a tennis parent. If you like what you've heard, please subscribe to us and write a review on iTunes. For more information on navigating the junior and college tennis journey, visit us online at ParentingAces.com. As always, a huge thank you to our sponsor, TennisBalls.com.